So welcome back to WCHS. We're going to do a quick review of the second unit of the year, the Contemporary Globalization unit. And as we do a quick review, some of the stuff we're talking about here will help you with the A1 final, because the A1 final is talking about the sustainability of contemporary globalization. So there is a lot of overlap here. The stuff I'm about to talk about should help you with some of the content for that. It's also meant to help you mostly, though, with the multiple choice. So you may remember this unit, Unit 2, began in Chapter 9 with a look at the conditions leading up to Bretton Woods. And make a long story short, the cost of conflict and competition was too high. So nations looked at the cost of World War I, the cost of World War II, the lost opportunities due to tariffs during the Great Depression, and they said we need to integrate and cooperate rather than compete and isolate. So it leads to a conference at Bretton Woods where they decide to create a new world order based on trade liberalization. Trade liberalization is free trade. It's global capitalism. We want access to your markets. We want access to your materials. We don't want to have to go to war to get that. We want to have legislation in place so that Canadians can sell products to Americans. Americans can sell products to Canadians without a lot of unnecessary taxes in place that make that transaction less viable. So then we study Bretton Woods and we look at the IMF and World Bank in Chapter 9, and both of them were dedicated to rebuilding Europe at the end of World War II. But then, once Europe was rebuilt, they began to turn their attention to the developing world. The World Bank is also part of the legacy of what some might argue some kind of American agenda to spread their control around the world. So the World Bank and the IMF today, they do have some opponents. Part of the anti-globalization movement focuses on the legacies of the World Bank and the IMF. So even though initially when we look at the textbook, page 228, it looks like, how can somebody find these controversial? They seem to be instruments of good. They have been associated with an American-led agenda to spread American corporate opportunities at the expense of indigenous people. So let's open your country up for trade, and as we do that, we'll control the cost of a commodity like water, and now your people become more impoverished, as we saw in Bolivia. So there's a nice contrast between the IMF and World Bank on page 228. Good morning. Good. I have a test with my 30s next block, yes. Yeah, you bet. Okay. Yeah, you bet. Okay, bye. If you need to know the difference between the World Bank and the IMF, because there is an overlap. Remember, we looked at it. They're across the street from each other. What is it that is different about the two? Well, again, on page 228, there's a great Venn diagram. World Bank today is more about lending money. The IMF is more today, although they do provide some loans, they provide advice and structural adjustments. And they try to look at more of the monetary side by looking at currencies. But definitely, that's a very fine-tuning question to say what's the difference. We shouldn't anticipate that. Also in Chapter 9, we look at the legacy of some of the economists. We had Milton Friedman, along with Hayek and Ayn Rand and Adam Smith. They're pushing for capitalism. Whereas we looked at some others like Keynes, who wanted some kind of regulated capitalism. He wanted a bigger presence of the government in the marketplace. Skipping ahead to Chapter 10. Chapter 10 is where we jumped into outsourcing. And we've added to the textbook, right? We've updated the textbook. We've added words like near sourcing and offshoring and nearshoring and onshoring to that conversation. This chapter also looks at containerization. We looked at Malcolm, and we looked at how he created these boats that these containers for boats, that could be easily taken off and put onto trains and moved around, and that would speed up the process. We can't have globalization without containerization because much of the products would spoil en route. So containerization was a necessary step to really open up the world market because it sped up transportation times. We looked at the media again, and this chapter jumps back to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, that sets rules for world trade and settles disputes if there's a dispute among countries. We also looked at the international agreement of Nafta and the more current, because the textbook's outdated again, USMCA. The USMCA is an international agreement between Canada, US, and Mexico to try to further integrate our economies to create more economic opportunity for trade. This chapter also looked at the EU, which is more than an international organization because there's additional layers that NAFTA doesn't have. There's a parliament, there's a constitution, and therefore it's the best example of supranationalism we have today, where national identities begin to kind of be lost. So in Europe today, in the EU, you can travel from France into Liechtenstein, and many people do. They might work in Liechtenstein and live in France, or vice versa, and they don't have to cross a border and check in and stuff like that. So the border's becoming a little less significant. This chapter also reintroduced transnationals, a transnational, their national identity is blurry, and it connected us to issues like e-commerce and oil. Continuing on with chapter 11, that's where they talk about sustainability, which we know are A1 finals about, so you could always have your textbook open and be looking at chapter 11 while I'm talking about it. It introduced us to the concept of ecological footprints, the amount of earth that is required to sustain our lifestyle. So if I eat a lot of meat, the meat that I eat, if I eat, say, beef, that beef needs to live somewhere. It occupies a presence on this earth. If I eat free-range animals, they need a bigger part of the earth to roam. How much of the earth is needed to satisfy and fulfill my consumer wants and needs? And there's a comparison of ecological footprints in the textbook, and the idea is that Canada has an alarming large ecological footprint. We also looked at population growth and this idea that post-industrial revolution, we're seeing an explosion of population, right? As a result of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we have lower cases of child mortality, and we have more longevity. People's lives are longer. More children are having an opportunity to have children of their own. So we have this population spike as a result of modernity, of civilization, of modern healthcare and medicine that can be traced back to the Industrial Revolution. This chapter also introduced concepts like flags of convenience, that some countries tax less, where they have access to more ports, and therefore people might put their flags on their boats. Talked about the Kyoto Protocol, which has been replaced by the Paris Climate Accords, and we talked about how not everybody's bought into that. We had a lesson specifically about Alberta's oil sands, and the textbook talks about some of the pros and cons of them, the controversy surrounding them. Chapter 12, same topic as chapter 11, sustainability, but now they add a layer of prosperity. Can prosperity be sustainable? And the stock market right now is saying no. Sustainable development. How can we develop in a way that has a net zero impact on the planet? How can we reduce our emissions? If we're talking about sustainable prosperity, one necessary condition to do is, how do we measure prosperity? And who's measuring it? So we look at things like per capita income, we look at gross national happiness, and the Human Development Index on page 282 which looks at longevity, knowledge, and standard of living. The textbook also has some pause for celebration, some pause for hope. The knowledge economy gives us an example that mankind is innovative, and through our innovative ability, we may be able to address our challenges of the 21st century. So if the question is saying, to what extent is globalization not sustainable, and one of the answers is knowledge economy, that would have to be a wrong answer. This chapter also introduces us to the concept of privatization, which we saw in Cochabamba with the privatizing of water in a very controversial way as directed by the World Bank to qualify for loans. The textbook also introduces the UN Millennium Development Goals. I would expect to see that on the final exam, Part B. It's a nice list of these were the challenges, the UN said. Eradicate poverty, achieve universal primary education, empower women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat diseases like HIV and AIDS and malaria, ensure sustainable environmental development, and develop a partnership. That list can help you with your A1 we're doing today and tomorrow. It also talks about the climate change and climate chaos, global warming. And then we get into related issue 4. We spent a significant amount of time talking about human rights. We looked at the evolution of human rights. We looked at key milestones during that time, but we focused mostly on the waves of feminism. The first wave, to achieve some political equality. The second and third waves, to look at social and economic equality. And now the fourth wave, which is using social media as a mechanism to unite women globally. The textbook talks about other milestones like the UN Declaration of Human Rights on page 311 and the Canadian Charter as well. Go back and look at those before your Part B of your exam. Textbook also in this chapter talks about some threats to human rights like human trafficking, sex trafficking, and some abusive authoritarian governments like China on page 319. We see some torture on page 320 as well, and some of the torture has been committed by not authoritarian regimes, but countries like America due to the war on terror. And we talked about the word illiberalism. This idea that a liberal government, a democracy, not liberal like Justin Trudeau, but liberal like democracy and freedom, can somehow behave like a dictator would. Then the course really quickly moved towards the end. We talked about different gaps, including the previously mentioned gaps that women see in terms of their salaries that they get paid and other things like that. We looked at the concept of fair trade, and then we looked at pandemics and the concept of citizenship. And that was our course in that sense. Looking at the actual exam, you're going to see a source on the 22nd that is going to be talking about those sustainable development goals. So there'll be a visual for you to unpack about that. There'll be a cartoon that looks at the consequence or the externality of using up resources, including water. How we've created an earth that is seeing desertification and the threat that means for us as people living within the biosphere. Where are we getting our food from if the earth is so dry as a consequence of our economic activities? So there's lots of questions about sustainable development goals. There's a cartoon about COVID and its impact on the world economy. There's some speakers talking about COVID as well. There's going to be a source that looks at ecological footprints and compares them. So we need to be aware of what an ecological footprint is. There's going to be some sources that look at disparity between the developed and the developing world. There'll be words like privatization and deregulation that are coupled with trade liberalization in terms of making this global free market. We'll look at the concept of sustainable development multiple times. and the inequality between people multiple times. Transnationals pop up, you know, the agenda of transnationals, and that's what you should expect source-wise on the topic B. Terminology again. We've talked about transnational corporations. We've talked about non-governmental organizations, NGOs. We talked about depression and consumerism and regulation, outsourcing and trade blocks. We talked about global pandemics, democracy, stewardship, the idea that we need to care for and protect the planet, carrying capacity attached to that. You know, how many people can the planet sustain? Interdependence, that we rely upon others. So I would suggest to you, my friends, that during the final exam, you're not going to be able to put up your hand and ask me, hey, what does this word mean? That's what the topic B final is a test of, to some extent, of have you a working understanding of the language of this course. So once we're done A1 today and tomorrow and A2 next week, how do you study for the multiple choice? You need to go back through your notes, your glossary of key terms, and understand what those words mean, because those are the building blocks of the questions. If you don't understand what a term means, then you're guessing at the question. That's the best way to understand the test. And this video, along with the two I previously recorded, it mentions all the key terms on the exam. Go back, rewatch these videos.